Hello and welcome to this video on how to get an A-star in sociology when we're looking at Marxism. So by the end of today we'll be able to describe what the Marxist theory is, apply it to some examples in society, and then start to analyse the positives and the negatives and evaluate whether it's an effective theory for the day. So going back to the type of perspective, it is a conflict perspective and it is very much based around structure, which means we examine society from the top to look down at individual behaviour. It's a conflict theory in the same way that feminism is. So it starts with the development of the writings of Karl Marx, who's writing from about 1840 to about 1870 in the 19th century. It's very much based around the expansion of capitalism at the end of the Industrial Revolution as an economic system and the conditions associated with it. Now, if you look at the time that he's living in, there's mass exploitation due to the factories and the type of conditions that people are living in. He sees society as a struggle based on class, and that is the bourgeoisie who own the means of production and the exploited who he calls the proletariat. He sees profit as the accumulation of this exploitation. So the workers are the masses, the bourgeoisie are the owners of the means of production. He sees the bourgeois as controlling the economic base. This is known as the superstructure, and therefore controlling it. They attempt to keep the masses ignorant of their exploitation through ideological control. So instead of socialization being about bringing you into line for value consensus, Marx sees socialization as creating ideological control, reinforcing false class consciousness. They use different apparatus to achieve this. Workers become alienated from the process of production. They see themselves as a machine and alienated from the means of production. So false class consciousness is the idea that you and I are completely unaware of the exploitation that goes on around us, and that we've had our means of production taken away from us and exploited by the bourgeoisie because we're happy, because we have a happy family, we have a good job, we have a nice car, we have a nice item of clothing, etc. And this hides the fact that we are exploited. Karl Marx and later Engels see competition leading to increasing amount of exploitation, and they see therefore that it would eventually lead to self-destruction. So the exploitation that Marxism, that capitalism needs, will eventually cause its self-destruction. And if you play this out as a chain of reasoning, if one company lowers its prices and increases the amount of time that people have to work to increase profits, then another company will do the same. Then in response, the first company will increase the amount of time that people work. So exploitation will go up in search of increased profit. Society would have to revolt against the bourgeoisie and would eventually reform along the lines of a communist society, which means that production, the means of production, is publicly shared. Karl Marx spent the last few years of his life conducting social research into the levels of exploitation and suggesting that action needed to be taken to create this class war. Now, these theories were developed by Antonio Gramsci, who's a humanist, and he's the co-founder of the Italian Communist Party. He develops the idea that social control comes out of ideological illusions. He calls this hegemony. It's class domination through persuasion. He sees this going through two ways, which is consent and coercion. So in the one case, you've got the positive social control through institutions like religion and the media and education. These are all coercing you, all consent, persuading you that the ruling class ideology is the right way. And then you've got coercion, when you go against this, to the courts, the criminal justice system, etc., the police force, acting against you. Therefore, the working class can only lead a revolution through a solution. So he differs from Karl Marx in suggesting that it was not inevitable, that the working class had to create their own organic intellectuals and lead a counter-hegemonic revolution. Now, that was disagreed on by Louis Althusser, who argues that Marx's concepts reject economic determinism and humanism. He argues that society actually has 3 levels rather than this 2-level system, the superstructure that you've seen in the first slide. The 3 levels are the economic, the political, and the ideological. And they have relative autonomy from the economic level. So political and ideological state apparatus are separate from the economic state apparatus. So the state performs political and ideological functions that ensure the reproduction of capitalism through repressive state apparatus like the police and ideological state apparatuses like the school. Now, when we apply this to real-world examples in education, Marxism crops up as suggesting that people are socialised to encourage hierarchy, meritocracy. They're encouraged to be obedient, and that's what schools do by having a teacher that you're supposed to listen to. That's just reinforcing the principles of work and, of course, preventing you from having a class consciousness and preventing you from trying to overthrow the bourgeoisie. Education also encourages the idea that you get what you deserve. In fact, when we look at education, it's often the case that you have very little influence over how your life is going to turn out through education. It's down to chance and who you're born to. It crops up in family. Parents naturally want the best for their family. This is reinforced by all of media adverts that suggest if you spend money on these products, then you'll have the best life for your family. Parents are therefore encouraged to work harder, to earn more money, to spend money on their family, and it also makes workers happy, and it reinforces false class consciousness. So one of the reasons why I continue to go to work every day is because no matter how bad a day I have, when I go home, I have my family there that love me, that worship, that nurture me and help me, and then I am able to go back into work on a Tuesday morning rather than overthrow the bourgeoisie and get rid of my head teacher. Crops up in religion. Now, Karl Marx originally says it's the opium of the people. This is often misinterpreted to mean that he just sees it as purely a negative. He doesn't. He sees it as a way of nurturing the working class. He sees it not as needed in a communist state, though, and it's developed later with the ideas of Ernst Bloch, who argues the dual character of religion. They argue that it can bring about social change and it can help a revolution occur, so that religion isn't just this stumbling block, this ideological apparatus, but can actually help revolution occur. And when we look at South America and liberalisation over there, then we can see that working class people are supported by the church. And it crops up in crime. Crime is perhaps the biggest area where we see Marxism applying. In terms of capitalism, it encourages crime as a system. The criminal justice system, though, works entirely in the interest of the elite. All classes commit crime, but society focuses on the working class to reinforce a false class consciousness. And actually, it's often the middle class and the upper class crime that does the most damage, albeit economically rather than physically. Yet our entire system focuses on the physical harm that working class people often perpetrate. Now, in terms of evolution, class is still a massive division for us, especially if we think globally. We can actually see ourselves in the West as perhaps part of the bourgeoisie, and those in the East as part of the exploited proletariat. You only have to look at bank bailouts to suggest that economic power is still massively disproportionate. You and I are continuing to pay for the mistakes made in global crises decades ago. Billions of UK pounds was spent bailing out banks. Economic power is still disproportionate. We can also look at individualization. The idea over the last 30, 40, 50 years that we've become more individualized is actually perhaps just another extension of false class consciousness. And of course, exploitation. Workers around the world are exploited. Britain is no different from everywhere else. However, we can criticise it more generally by saying, well, yeah, absolutely, there is class still there, but it's far more complex than just bourgeoisie versus proletariat. For example, 70% of the UK own the property. Now, that was one of the key factors of Karl Marx, that land was owned by the bourgeoisie. Well, we can't all be the bourgeoisie. Capitalism is certainly less exploitive than ever it was before. If you look at the 1920s, then you can understand what Karl Marx was saying with people like Ford But capitalism today is far less exploitive. We see also in the 1950s a move towards Keynesian economics, which places a lot more emphasis on helping out the proletariat. Relative autonomy. There are many critics of capitalism in today's society. You just have to look in Occupy Wall Street over in America and the similar events that happened over here, just to see that there is criticism of capitalism. Of course, we can counter-argue that this might just be the last strains of the dying capitalist system, and that a revolution is just about to occur. It's also criticised heavily because it's deterministic. It takes away your individual choices, and of course we look at examples like China, where there's autocratic communism, and many countries are still socialist today. And lastly, communism, which failed in the USSR, although this would be countered by Marxists who would argue that it wasn't true communism. So, when we look back, we've got A01. We can now define what the proletariat and the bourgeoisie are. We can argue how society is controlled according to Marxists. We can apply it to some real-world examples in the family and education, etc. And we can now criticise it internally through Althusser and Gramsci, and also externally through other methods. Where, if we were to look at feminism, feminists would criticise it by saying that actually the form of exploitation isn't workers and bourgeoisie, it's far more towards gender. It would be criticised by functionalists to say that it ignores many of the positives that happens in society. It would be criticised by social action, who argue that it's deterministic. Thank you very much, and look forward to seeing you in the next video.